Hey everyone, welcome to the Happy Flosser podcast. My name is Billy Lunt. I am your host, and I'm here to talk to you about all things dental hygiene to support you on your journey through the dental hygiene program. It's really great to have you with me today. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about how the brain functions and how the brain works and what the brain does during the learning process that can work either for or against you. And maybe you're a student who's already taken anatomy and physiology, so you can understand some of the anatomy pieces and functions of the brain and the nervous system and how it all kind of connects, but maybe not. So we'll go over some of the basics about how the brain works and what structures in the brain function in certain ways to help you be successful as a learner enrolled in dental hygiene school. Because there's a lot of myths about how the brain works. And what I think is so fascinating, I can still remember I read this article. It was probably around 2002. It was in a journal, and it said that everything that we've learned about the heart in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s was pretty significant, and that we were going to, in medicine, make big strides in the 2000s and up to today in how we learn about and understand the functions of the brain. And I was really excited about that. And I have to say, reflecting back, that has become the truth. We've learned so much about how the brain functions and how the brain works, and how in society our nervous system either impedes and impacts our brain, things like mindfulness and having this level of awareness and consciousness and understanding how the subconscious mind and the conscious mind work. All of that stuff is fairly new information that all of us are being exposed to. So it's really great to use that as a tool for your success in your learning journey as a dental hygiene student. So there are three structures in the brain that are mostly involved in learning: the hippocampus, the cerebrum, and the basal ganglion. And it's important for you to just kind of reflect back on A and P so that you can say, okay, well, why is this important to me? It's important for you to know what happens in the brain when you're learning so that you can use that to your advantage when you are learning, right? What helps you remember something or not remember something on a test or an exam? So your recall and your recognition of information. It's important for you to know how that brain is functioning to either work for you or against you. Because recalling something from memory it's pretty much an effortless process, but if you don't understand how that information happens, or something you learned in class, or you're taking a test and that question is popping out at you and you just can't remember all of that stuff, it's all systems in your brain and how these three things work together. So let's just talk about the hippocampus. It's that little horseshoe shaped area like in the middle of your brain. It's where you continually grow brain cells over the course of your lifetime. So that's really kind of cool. The fact that as a grown adult, you're still developing cells in this region of your brain, that lets you know that you can continue to learn throughout the course of your lifetime. Just that little anatomy piece goes a long way at helping you understand that you can actually learn new things over the course of your life because the cells are continuing to grow throughout your lifetime. Those are called neurons. So that area of the brain is associated with things like your short-term memory and spatial navigation. It also helps with important facts, new memories that you're forming, events that have occurred, experiences that you've been through, right? So a study found that people who experience extended periods of high stress have a reduction in their hippocampus. So a lot of people talk about the stress of dental hygiene school. So you want to make sure that you are keeping your stress level under control so that the important facts and the experiences and the memory events, things that you learn in and out of the classroom, are things that you can retrieve, that you can retain and then go back to that information on. Now, the cerebrum is that prefrontal cortex. That's the area of your brain for critical learning, right? So it helps with complex functions and really important learning that has to occur. Your prefrontal is the hub for problem solving, decision making, right? So we all say frontal lobe development doesn't fully happen until you're 26 years of age. I want you to be careful. There's lots of myths about the brain. There's myths that you only use 10% of your brain. There's myths that, let's see, that you're either right-brained or left-brained. You actually use both sides of your brain all the time with lots of functions. Are there connections between our behavior patterns and certain areas of the brain? Maybe we strengthen some of the neural pathways on one side versus the other. Sure. But these myths that are there saying that we only use 10% of my brain. So definitely take those into consideration. But the prefrontal area of the brain is the hub for things like making decisions. It really helps us also organize information. So this does impact our decision making, right? So it helps us for setting goals, completing really complicated tasks, make decisions about our future. That's that prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal hub. So all of the complex functions that happen in our life, we're relying on that frontal lobe, that development, and that is a crucial area for learning. And then the third important structure that I want you to be aware of is the basal ganglion. And the basal ganglion is really important in dental hygiene, especially because it's about procedural learning, motor skill acquisition. The clinical piece of dental hygiene is really strong here for your basal ganglion. Any kind of repeated task that you are going to perform, you're relying on the basal ganglion in your brain in order to complete these tasks. It's really essential for things like coordinated movement, learning how to use your instruments in the clinical setting. Things that over time become automatic that you don't even have to think about. You are relying on the basal ganglion in your brain in order to develop those procedural skills. Positive reinforcement goes a long way at helping develop the skills, the procedural skills for basal ganglion. So let's talk about the learning process and how it interacts with the different areas of the brain so that it helps you with recall, recognition, and doing really well on your exams and your performance level in the clinical setting. So you have neural pathways. So neural pathways is really just a network of neurons, and they're responsible. So those are the roads in your brain, and those roads are responsible for communicating information in the brain, all over the brain. And you probably learned about neural pathways when you took anatomy and physiology, and you will have a great review about neural pathways when you take pain management, because neurons are really important to understand when you're giving local anesthesia, that's for sure. So then you have something called long-term potentiation. And this is the connection between the neurons. And the connection between these neurons, this is really cool, guys. This actually strengthens with repeated exposure to information. So think about that. Exposing yourself to content and information repeatedly strengthens that pathway between different neurons. So it makes it easier for you to recall the information in the future. So if you have a well-oiled path, right? If you have a path that you've done, traveled a road, maybe the road next to your house. If you have a road that you've traveled on umpteen times, you know it like the back of your hand, it's easier for you to navigate. This is very much the same in your brain. The long-term potentiation occurs when you have repeated exposure to information and you can recall that information in the future because you've done things like attend the lecture and you've heard the information. You've studied a whole bunch. You're listening to my podcast episode. This helps strengthen the connection between those neural pathways. The neurons in that network get stronger. And so it helps when you do recall. So think about that. So you're strengthening that long-term potentiation, makes it easier for you to recall information because those neural pathways, those roads in between the neurons have been well oiled, that you are very familiar with those things. And then the neurotransmitters, right? This is how the learning process happens. So after they're released, they attach to the receptors and that triggers a response, right? So those are the chemical transmitters in your brain. So think about those as like little cars on the neural pathways that contain chemicals, and they go between one neuron and the next. So when you learn something new, the neural pathway is created. You develop a deeper understanding as you expose that information over and over and over in different ways, right? So your long-term potentiation increases, and the chemicals that transmit across those neural pathways, it's a continuous dumping. Dopamine is the chemical that goes across that neural pathway, right? The neurotransmitter that contains the chemical dopamine. It travels across that pathway. So what I want you to think about, what does dopamine do for you as a learner? So dopamine creates motivation, right? It's a pleasure response. If you listen to the episode on the autonomic nervous system, I talk about dopamine in there. I talk about your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system and how we have all these automatic things that occur. The release of dopamine in your brain is no different. But what it does for your learning process is that it influences things like your motivation. When you receive a reward or you have reinforced positive reinforcement on experiences that you have in your learning. Maybe you got yourself really organized and you practiced for that skill eval that you had in clinic, and then your faculty gave you great praise for your outcome or how you performed because you were relying on that repeated practice and you really oiled that pathway. So you were able to use your basal ganglia to really connect with that procedural piece, and the dopamine was released because you got the good grade, you got the positive reinforcement from your faculty. So it's a reward system built into your brain to help reinforce that positive movement. You're being organized, it keeps your motivation going, it helps you break down complex things so that you know, okay, this is working. Your brain makes an adjustment and goes in that direction. So when you have the opposite thing happen, maybe you weren't motivated, maybe you got a bad grade on something, you have to reassess yourself and then get yourself in the zone where you're like, okay, I have to connect these neurons on this pathway. I have to expose myself to the information more. I have to make some adjustments in my stress level so that my brain is functioning properly so that I can recall and retain this information. So these are things that you need to think about. Ha ha ha! It's in your brain, right? I just also want to say that things like stress, sleep, all of those things play a role in how your brain functions. So I don't want to disregard that. I'm literally talking about how the learning process happens and when you have repeated exposure. So how can we use this information to have better outcomes as a student? One of the things you can do is look for the things in the classroom that really interest you as part of the learning process. Understand what you're exposed to and how that can be utilized when you're outside the classroom to really make things easier for you to stay motivated. Maybe clinic is where you're passionate. Maybe you really just love learning the instruments, understanding the process of assessment and going through the steps and keeping yourself organized in that way. See if something that interests you in that clinical piece can be carried over into the theory part or some of your didactic courses so that you can still stay engaged and have that dopamine transmitted across those neurotransmitters for you. Find a way to keep it interesting in both your clinical and your didactic courses. You want to leverage the basal ganglia's role in that habit formation. Habits and consistency really help create patterns in your brain across these neurotransmitters so that things just become automatic. That's why things are really hard in your first semester. When you first enroll in dental hygiene, you don't have all of these habits formed. You don't have all these neurotransmitters going on in your brain. You certainly have a lot of neurons firing, but getting yourself organized in your thoughts and how the methods and how you're actually attacking some of these tasks that you have to do will really set things straight in your brain. And that's why you might reflect when you get to your second and third semesters that things don't seem as hard as far as the process and the procedures of school. It's just that the content might get a little more complex and a little more challenging. But how you are performing and how you're tackling things as a student gets a little easier because you're forming these habits. You're leveraging your basal ganglia. You just didn't know that that's what you were doing. One of the other things that you can do is break down some of the complex tasks and information into small, manageable pieces, right? Organize and prioritize. This is how we use our prefrontal cortex to the best of our ability. I myself, when I start a new semester, am pretty much feeling a little overwhelmed. But once I sit down and I strategize and organize my whole semester, break it down into, okay, what projects are due? When are they due? Okay, what tasks do I have to do? How am I going to organize my semester so that I can stay on task? Things get a little bit easier when you break things down and you organize them because it helps organize your brain. And I can't stress enough, use a reward system to boost your own motivation and reinforce your learning. Because remember, the brain releases dopamine when you do that. I personally like to start my day organized and have a cup of coffee, a little bit of espresso. It's my built-in reward for starting my day off on the right foot. I get up, I set my priority list, I create 3 intentions for my day. I have this really cool week organizer that a good coworker, a really nice coworker bought for me for Christmas. I set that up and I have my day organized, and a reward for myself is to have an espresso. So I start my day off with a little bit of a reward after I've organized and prioritized my day. I want you to do the same thing because using that reward system is just going to set you up for more success as the day unfolds. If you complete all your homework ahead of time, go get yourself a nice Java somewhere if you like coffee, or maybe coffee's not your jam. Whatever it is that you like to do to give yourself a little reward, something small, doesn't have to be significant. It still releases that dopamine. So even just give yourself a sticker, put a sticker on your calendar in your daily planner that day, just to say, you know what, I did it. I did great today. I motivated myself. I stayed organized. I put a plan together and I was able to check everything, check all the boxes on my list. It goes a long way at really solidifying your neural pathways and getting yourself into a stable zone. And then the last thing that I just want to stress, how do we use the information about how our brain works and how the neurons fire and how the transmitters work and how that potential, how that long-term potentiation is developed. When you are learning new material or new skills, what I want you to do is review the material consistently to improve the connections of that long-term potentiation. This will make recall so much easier. If you are with your study group and your study group comes up with a really nifty way for you to recall and reinforce information, that's fantastic. Keep reminding yourself of that. It's an example of this would be that eruption date phone number that I shared with you. I also put that on my Instagram page for everyone in the world. Having a phone number that you can recall and then connecting that to the eruption date patterns, that's an example of how the brain creates those pathways so that you can recall information. But in order for that to happen for you, you have to continually revisit it and have consistency with that so that that pathway stays strong. I hope this information was helpful for you guys on how the brain works. That is just the tip of the iceberg. I think the more that I learn about the brain, the more inspired and it's just an awe. I'm in awe of how we just have so much potential and we have so much ability. What we're capable of is just so much more than what I understand. And I have to say, isn't that the way with everything? I feel like the more I learn about something, the more I realize that I don't know anything about anything. It's almost like a discovery of how little you know and a realization that there's never enough time to learn everything at the level that you really want to. So this is really I'm not a brain scientist, but I do like to understand how students learn because it makes my job more impactful. I can have a better impact on you. This is what's so great about podcasting is that you can go back and listen to an episode as many times as you need to really create that pathway in your mind. I hope this was helpful. Please share this podcast with your friends and on your socials so that everyone can hear it and have access to it to help them on their journey. Have a great week, guys.